On a frigid morning in the 8th century, somewhere within the labyrinthine scriptoria of early medieval Rome, a clandestine hand meticulously penned words that would reshape the course of Western civilization. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp stone, and drying ink. Light from a narrow arched window barely pierces the gloom, falling upon a wooden desk cluttered with pumice for smoothing parchment, sharp quills, and pots of iron gall ink. Here, an anonymous scribe, perhaps a cleric acting under direct papal instruction, is engaged in an act of profound creation and equally profound deception. This was no ordinary document, but a daring fabrication, the donation of Constantine. The script is careful, imitating the imperial chancery style of a bygone era, each letter a deliberate stroke meant to convey authenticity and unquestionable authority. The parchment itself, carefully prepared calfskin, feels ancient, important. Yet, the story it tells is a masterpiece of political and theological invention. The document purports to be an imperial decree from the 4th century Roman emperor Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor. It spins a dramatic tale. Constantine, afflicted with leprosy, is miraculously cured through the intercession of Pope Sylvester I, who baptizes him into the Christian faith. In a gesture of immense gratitude and piety, the newly converted emperor bestows upon Sylvester and all his successors, the popes of Rome, a gift of staggering proportions. He grants them not just spiritual primacy over all other patriarchates, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem, but also temporal, earthly power. The donation claims Constantine handed over the Lateran Palace, the city of Rome, and all the provinces, places, and cities of Italy and the western regions. He effectively makes the Pope a king, an emperor in his own right, even transferring the imperial insignia, the diadem, the purple cloak, the scepter, to the papal office before symbolically relocating his own capital to the new city of Constantinople, leaving the West to the dominion of the Church. To understand why such an audacious forgery was necessary, we must step into the precarious world of the 8th century papacy. The Western Roman Empire was a distant memory, a ghost haunting the ruins that surrounded the city. The Pope was squeezed between two menacing forces. From the north, the Lombard kings pressed down on Italy, threatening to conquer Rome itself and extinguish the last vestiges of its independence. From the east, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, the theoretical successor to Roman authority, offered little real protection and often demanded theological submission, a dynamic that chafed against Rome's claims of spiritual leadership. The papacy was politically vulnerable, militarily weak, and desperate for a powerful, reliable ally. That ally emerged in the form of the Franks, a rising power north of the Alps under rulers like Pepin the Short and his son Charlemagne. To break free from Byzantine influence and fend off the Lombards, the Pope needed to forge a new alliance. But on what grounds could the Pope, a spiritual leader, claim the authority to anoint kings, dispose of territories, and act as a sovereign political player on the European stage? He needed a legal and historical precedent. Where none existed, one had to be invented. The donation of Constantine was the answer. It was a retroactive justification, a historical anchor dropped into the 4th century to legitimize the political ambitions of the 8th. It was a tool designed to elevate the Bishop of Rome above all other patriarchs, and, crucially, to grant him the legal right to rule territory and engage with secular monarchs as, at the very least, their equal. The tension is palpable. A single, anonymous act of deception laid the groundwork for centuries of papal supremacy, yet its very existence challenged the spiritual purity the Church proclaimed, an institution supposedly founded on the eternal truth of the gospel. It was a paradox forged in ink and parchment, a worldly solution to a worldly problem, cloaked in the sacred language of divine will and imperial piety. How could such an audacious lie hold sway over kings and emperors for centuries, defining the very boundaries of spiritual and earthly power? Building on that audacious forgery, we trace how the donation of Constantine transitioned from a whispered claim in a Roman scriptorium to an unassailable pillar of papal authority throughout the Middle Ages. The document, once a strategic fiction, began to circulate, its influence growing with each passing decade. Imagine a grand ceremony in the 10th century, inside the cavernous nave of Old St. Peter's Basilica. A Holy Roman Emperor, perhaps Otto I, kneels before the Pope. The air is heavy with incense, the sound of Gregorian chants echoing off the marble. The Pope, seated on his throne, places the imperial crown upon the emperor's head, an act of immense symbolic weight. This document became the legal and theological bedrock for this very moment. The Pope isn't merely a spiritual leader offering a blessing. He is, according to the donation, the heir to Constantine's imperial authority in the West. He is the one who hands the crown, who legitimizes the emperor's rule. The emperor, in turn, accepts his power from the hands of the church, implicitly acknowledging a hierarchy where spiritual authority holds precedence over the temporal. This ritual, repeated for centuries, was political theater underwritten by a forged document. The donation's true power was unleashed during the High Middle Ages, becoming a formidable weapon in the church's arsenal. During the 11th century investiture controversy, a titanic struggle between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, the document was a cornerstone of the papal argument. The conflict centered on a critical question: who had the right to appoint, or invest, bishops and abbots, the king or the pope? For the emperor, these were not just religious figures. They were powerful feudal lords who controlled vast lands and armies. For the pope, allowing a secular ruler to appoint spiritual leaders was an intolerable corruption of the church's independence. In his sweeping Gregorian reforms, Pope Gregory VII asserted papal supremacy in all matters, both spiritual and temporal. The donation of Constantine provided the perfect historical justification. If Constantine himself had ceded the West to the papacy, then surely the Pope had the ultimate authority over all appointments within that territory. The document was cited by canon lawyers and theologians, lending the weight of ancient imperial law to the Pope's revolutionary claims. It was incorporated into influential collections of canon law, most notably the Galliania in the 12th century, which became the foundational text for medieval church law. Once enshrined in these legal texts, its authenticity was no longer questioned. It was simply fact, a legal precedent taught in the burgeoning universities of Bologna and Paris. The societal consequences were immense and tangible. The donation provided the legal basis for the existence of the Papal States, a swath of territory in central Italy ruled directly by the Pope. This made the Pope not just a spiritual leader, but a monarch, a temporal prince who waged wars, signed treaties, and collected taxes. This fusion of spiritual and political power fundamentally shaped the European continent. It meant that for nearly a millennium, the political landscape was defined by this delicate, often violent dance between popes and kings. The blurred lines between spiritual duty and civil obligation were solidified, creating a world where excommunication was a political weapon and heresy was a state crime. The grand cathedrals and monasteries that dotted the landscape were not just houses of worship. They were centers of political, economic, and legal power, a power ultimately traced back to a foundational myth of an emperor's gift. Thinkers, rulers, and commoners alike accepted this reality. For them, the donation was not a forgery. It was a sacred inheritance, a testament to the divine favor bestowed upon the See of St. Peter. It was the story they told themselves to make sense of their world. What happens when a foundational myth, believed to be divine truth, dictates the fate of nations for so long? What intellectual earthquake would be required to shatter a foundation built on 7 centuries of acceptance? Following centuries of its undisputed authority, the question lingered in the quietest corners of scholarly inquiry: who would dare challenge the very bedrock of papal power? The answer came not from a king or a rival pope, but from a scholar with a quill, working in the 15th century amidst the intellectual ferment of the Italian Renaissance. This was an age of explosive rediscovery, of humanism, of a new and daring creed, back to the sources. In this climate, a brilliant and fiercely independent humanist named Lorenzo Valla embarked on a meticulous textual analysis that would become one of the most stunning acts of scholarly detective work in history. Poring over ancient Latin manuscripts in the libraries of Naples and Rome, Valla was armed with a new and powerful tool, philology, the critical study of language and literature. He wasn't reading the donation of Constantine as a sacred, timeless truth. He was reading it as a historical artifact, a piece of text that had to be consistent with the time it claimed to be from. And under his critical gaze, the ancient facade began to crumble. Valla's treatise laid out his case with irrefutable, systematic precision. He attacked the document from every conceivable angle. First, the language. Valla, a master of classical Latin, immediately recognized that the vocabulary and style were utterly wrong for the 4th century. The text was filled with barbarisms and expressions that belonged to the vulgar Latin of the 8th or 9th century, not the elegant classical Latin of Constantine's court. He pointed to the use of the word fief, a term central to Germanic feudalism that would have been completely alien to a 4th century Roman. It was like finding the word smartphone in a document supposedly written by Shakespeare. He then dismantled its historical claims. The document refers to Constantinople as a patriarchate, a status it only achieved much later. It has the emperor speaking of satraps ruling his provinces, a Persian term that a Roman emperor would never have used. Valla even pointed out the sheer absurdity of the narrative. No contemporary source from the 4th century, not one, ever mentions this monumental transfer of power. Not St. Jerome, not St. Augustine, no one. Why, Valla asked, would the most significant political event in Roman history be met with complete silence by everyone who lived through it? The unmasking of this grand deception was an intellectual bombshell whose shockwaves spread far beyond the confines of academia. Valla was working for King Alfonso of Aragon, who was in a political dispute with the Pope, giving his work immediate political relevance. Though the Catholic Church initially suppressed his findings, placing his treatise on the index of prohibited books, it was too late. With the invention of the printing press, Valla's arguments began to circulate widely. They found their most potent audience among the burgeoning voices of reform north of the Alps. Decades later, figures like Martin Luther seized upon Valla's work as definitive proof of the historical and moral corruption of the papacy. For the Protestant reformers, the donation was not just a mistake, it was a deliberate, fraudulent power grab, a symbol of everything that was wrong with an institution that had strayed from its spiritual mission. Valla's scholarly exposé became a powerful weapon in the Reformation, helping to shatter the monolithic unity of Western Christendom. The discovery forced a profound reckoning within Christianity, challenging the very nature of truth and authority. It demonstrated that tradition, even centuries-old tradition, was not immune to historical scrutiny. The story of the donation of Constantine is more than a curious historical footnote. It is a powerful parable about the enduring tension between faith and evidence, power and truth. It reveals how narratives, whether true or false, can construct entire worlds, legitimize empires, and shape the course of history. Lorenzo Valla's courageous act of intellectual honesty shows us that a single critical mind, armed with evidence and a commitment to the truth, can indeed unmask a lie, and in doing so, change the world.